So, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are. We're very happy to see so many new faces, as I said. And for those who don't know me, my name is Tshireen, and I'm the director of Atassi Foundation. And just to give you a little bit of context, Atassi Foundation is a family initiative that we created about 10 years ago. And the purpose was to promote and preserve Syrian art and create knowledge around it. Syria is multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious, and we wanted to celebrate it by bringing to light its modern and contemporary art. So MASA, or Modern Art of Syria Archive, was a dream that we managed to make a reality. It's a digital archive platform that documents and researches Syrian art. It's a repository. Today we have over 3,800 records, and we have hundreds of books and publications. And this series, MASA Talks, is meant to complement these archives by bringing them to life, and making them kind of the center of the conversations. It's important to know that these sessions are recorded and will be published on YouTube, so they remain live and they're accessible for people to go back to them. Today's session focuses on using family archives and artistic practices. And the talk is with artist Christine Gedeon. So without delay, I hand over to my colleague Mathilde, who is the curator of MASA Talks, and to Christine, whom we're very excited to talk to today. We will be opening the floor for questions and answers and discussions at the end of the session, so there's no time limit for that. And with that, I give you the floor, Mathilde and Christine.
Thank you very much, Tshireen. So today we are super happy to welcome Christine Gedeon for our third session of MASA Talks. It's the first session under the thematic of artists as archivists. So let me present our guest. Christine Gedeon is a Syrian-American artist. She was born in Aleppo. Her work explored themes of memory, mapping, displacement, and the intersection of personal and collective histories. She uses mixed media, installation, drawing, sound installation, and we will travel during this conversation through a few significant works of Christine that deal with archive and memory. So we will focus on three projects, and the first one is Syria, My Mother Speak. So hi, Christine.
Hi, Mathilde. Hi, everyone.
So maybe we will talk about the beginning of Syrian archive in your work, because your work often revisits family stories and the fragmented histories of Syria. Maybe my first question would be, how did you start working with archive? You mentioned it was with this sound installation, Syria, My Mother Speaks. Maybe you can say a few words before we can hear the installation.
Yeah, well, I started working with the topic of my family story and family history when the war in Syria had started. So around 2013, 2014 is when I began Syria as My Mother Speaks. And I was living in New York at the time, and my mother is in New Jersey. And of course, when the war had started in Syria, it was like a death for us. I mean, just the place that we came from is just disappearing from under us. And we still had family, we still had relatives that were living in Syria. So I was speaking to my mother on the phone, or when I would see her. I mean, New Jersey's close to New York. I would see her often, and we were always speaking about the war. And, so I would hear her stories of what was happening because she would be speaking to relatives there. And then I would turn on the news and hear, CNN's version and, the regular mainstream media's version. And I felt like I needed to do something with our stories, my personal family stories, and make them more, make them public, or not make them public, but just to do something, do an artwork with it. At the same time, my artwork before I started working on Syria projects was working with string installations, working with mapping and architecture. So Syria, as my mother speaks, was still in line visually with what I was doing before. But I could also say the inspiration for creating this as an instrument was when, at the same time, I read an op-ed by Nihat Cerise. Maybe I'm sure a lot of people here don't know who he is, but he's a Syrian novelist who lives in Berlin now, and he's considered the Kafka of the Middle East. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and it was titled "A Song of Lament for the Music of Syria." And he's also from Aleppo, and he was talking about the old tradition in Aleppo where people would sit after their meals and sit in their courtyard and play their string instruments and sing, and that was, also a form of storytelling. So that's when I connected that I wanted to record these conversations with my mother as a way of relaying the story through this interactive string instrument. And I had shown this. This is one iteration here on screen is what I showed at Jane Lombard Gallery in 2018, and that was already the fourth iteration. You'll see in the video, Mathilde, when you play the video, that one is the first iteration, and that was in the beautiful textile museum in Bocholt, Germany, which is a little bit outside of Dusseldorf. And since then, I even just showed it this year, too, at a gallery in Berlin. So I think I've shown it about 6 times so far.
Okay, so maybe I can play the video so everyone can listen this sound installation. So we wanted to show you an extract of this installation, which is actually as a music instrument with archive, memories, and music. We thought it was important, even if we're not in the space, to be able to understand the feeling of it. Can you tell us how do you decide what material, what music, how do you record, and what do you include in your artworks?
Yeah, well, I was working with a sound artist on this, and we together were finding different sounds and music to layer with. And then in terms of the conversations, I just was recording almost a lot, and then I just went through it and I found the ones that I thought were the most impactful, the ones that told the story that had the most resonance. And I just clipped them and cut them and sort of created this sound collage. And, you know, this is a short excerpt, which is actually quite mild. There's other excerpts where you have sounds of war and sounds of battle and Allahu Akbar, and which feels, a lot more jarring. But it's about a 15-minute piece. And each string just, it triggers the next sample in the piece. So it's telling the story while the viewer and the listener is interactively playing the instrument.
And actually, was it like a performative presentation, or could visitors play with the instrument?
Yeah, it's open for the visitors to play. Yeah, it's interactive. So most people, come and they're a little perplexed, and people are a little afraid to play it at first without getting some instructions because it seems so delicate, And but once it's an instrument that one needs to, has to learn to play. So once they learn how to play it, then they and it's interesting. It's the time, I've shown it 6 times. So just watching people's interaction with it, and also because this clip it was mostly in Arabic, but some English. I've transcribed it where people can read on text what exactly is happening, what my mother is speaking about. I purposely asked my mother to speak more in Arabic than in English, just because I wanted it to be the language of home, the language of Syria. She would skip a little bit to French sometimes. But the interesting thing is that the viewers who were playing the instrument, they would still stop and listen. And even if they didn't understand what she was saying, they would listen to the entire clip and take it in. And I think for me that was important because it wasn't just about the words, it was about the emotive tone that I was trying to bring across as well.
Yes, and I think we felt it now. And actually, each string was played individually, or sometimes you had like a few notes together to do. Like
no, that's not possible. You can't layer them because
okay.
it just triggers the next one.
Okay. So maybe now we can switch to another project, which is called Aleppo Deconstruction, Reconstruction. Aleppo is the city where you were born. In this work, you are using archival material such as maps, adding different layers to compile it with the narrative memories of your relatives. Do you feel that due to the impossibility of being in Aleppo during the war, you had to draw the city in a way, like to create a kind of new archive of maps and memories?
Exactly. That's why I created them as maps, because I felt that was the only way to solidify these places. And at the time when I was working on this, I had no idea. We're from West Aleppo, which I realized later that West Aleppo was under the Assad regime. It wasn't destroyed like the East. But at the time when I was working on this project, I had no idea the state of these buildings, of these places that are part of my family story. And I felt that creating these maps was a way to make it into something permanent, at least for myself, attached with the stories. So I was finding the locations. There's 15 different locations that I was asking, and it was mostly my mother and my uncle Nabil in this project. And, places like the day-to-day, like where we lived, the hospital we were born in, like this example you're showing. And then it gets into the more tragic, to where the first tragedy in my family history was in 1958 when Abdel Nasser became the president of the Syrian, when Egypt and Syria united, and he confiscated all of the everybody's private property, and my grandfather lost everything overnight. So that was very difficult for the family because they just had nothing. You know, they went from one day to being quite well off to absolutely nothing and couldn't even put food on the table. And that was the beginning of the downhill of my family, the Sadeh family's life in Syria. And then it goes a little bit, couple decades later, it goes into my uncle Michel's abduction and disappearance. And that's kind of is the apex for me of this whole project, which also we will talk about in a bit, but that led up to the latest project that I did of the film of my uncle's disappearance. But going back to this Aleppo deconstruction, reconstruction. So it first started out as just map drawings with stories for an exhibition in New York at Jane Lombard Gallery. And then because I felt like it just rendered so well to actually being a book, I got it published here as an art book by Kerber Verlag, and that was in 2020. And in the book, there was an essay by Nasser Rabat, The History of Syria. Nasser Rabat is the director of the Islamic architecture program at MIT. And he wrote a brief history of Syria because I think it's important for this. You know, this was separately from the exhibition. I felt like I needed to give more information about what was happening in Syria for people to really understand this work. And at the same time, I also included photographs, which I wouldn't include in the exhibition. So, and it's telling my family story.
Do you think actually you needed to write this history from being outside the country, but also because we need to write histories of Syria because we just had access to one version of the history since maybe 50 years, and the only way we have to write histories is to do it with personal histories.
Yeah, exactly. And I think growing up, I always knew that my family had a really interesting story, but honestly, most people from Syria have stories like this. And I think Mathilde, you also mentioned to me that I probably felt more at ease working on something like this versus if I were still in Syria because I'm an American. And at the time, Assad was still president, of course. So here I am publicly stating what the Assad regime did to my family as an American. And I had asked my relatives, I asked my cousins who were living in Syria at the time, or actually they were probably already in Beirut after the war had started. And I asked my uncle Nabil, who was in the States, you know, do you think it's okay to make these stories public? And they said, please do. I mean, I think within the family, there was just much more of a motivation to get these stories heard versus what could happen because honestly, and maybe I was being naive and maybe my uncle Nabil also, but he's right now he's fighting all these rebels, he's fighting ISIS, he's fighting is he going to come after Christine Gedeon telling a story from 40 years ago? You know, if Hafez al-Assad were still president, I probably wouldn't do this. I most likely wouldn't do this. But under Bashar, I just didn't think he's paying attention to something like this.
Mm-hmm. And do you think the use of maps is also a way to I mean, also the name of the project, Deconstruction, Reconstruction, and using map and drawing through the map was also a way to see what was still staying and what would maybe disappear and maybe to stick in a moment because the maps that you used are like maps from Google Maps.
Yeah.
And so it was a way, because it's from 2018, it was a way also to be sure that how was the city in a moment and that it might disappear after. I think also the map is a way to keep memory and to keep a moment.
Exactly. To keep the moment, to solidify it, as I was saying before, and also to attach these stories to it. And that's where the reconstruction comes as well. It's just taking bits and connecting the memories to these places where in my imagination, I had no idea if they even existed. So the only way I can reconstruct it was through these artworks.
And actually, we will mention it in a few minutes. But you've been to Aleppo recently, and it was also part of a kind of reconstruction. Maybe before we mention the Michel project, we can just go through another project which is called Family History. In this project, which is a few years previous than Aleppo Reconstruction, Deconstruction. You are sharing as if it was classified archives for some correspondences with your cousin. I say as if it was classified archive because we see that you taped some sensitive information and name. It's a bit of the beginning of the project, A Portrait of Michel. In this letter, we see that in these mails, we see that we can read that you are asking information to your cousin about some part of your family. Why do you think dealing with archive in the Syrian context, and especially given the country's political and forced disappearance, was something important?
Well, again, with the war had started, well, at this point, the war, it's already a few years into the war. This is, that's what triggered for me wanting to work on projects about Syria. Before that, if the war hadn't happened, I probably wouldn't be focusing on it. And also because I knew about my family history and also always knew about these stories. I'm going back to Michel's abduction. I grew up learning that. I mean, I'd met him and he disappeared like soon after I'd met him and I was a little kid. And, I was told just outrightly by my mother, he might have been a communist. He was speaking against the government. He got abducted. The jails in Syria are brutal. And learning all of that as a kid had such an impact on me. So it's just, I think fast forward so many years later, when the war in Syria had started, it still felt like this is something that had never gotten obviously resolved. And the memories were getting brought up again because I feel like the family sort of accepted at one point that he was no longer alive, that he was abducted and taken and put in prison, and he was one of the disappeared. And with the war starting and knowing that all of these people that are protesting against Assad, we knew what their fate was going to be. The conversation centered a lot around Michel. So that's why I wanted to work specifically on a project just of Michel. And you can see that I started it in 2014, and then I stopped for a while because I could not, besides getting stories from family, I really didn't have a visual. I didn't have anything that I can really work with to create a project. So in 2014, this is like you said before, I did Aleppo deconstruction, reconstruction. I had contacted a cousin who lives in Montreal and asked him. And so at that time, I had the idea to interview family and to reconstruct Michel's story. And I also was connecting it with Blow Up, the film Blow Up, the Antonioni film, where the photographer, I'm sure some people here know it, of course, had inadvertently photographed a crime scene, and he kept blowing up the image, blowing up the image, blowing it up until it's almost indecipherable to find something. And that, in my mind, was kind of the starting point of what I wanted to do with Michel's story. So of course, we're not going to be able to read the whole exchange between my cousin and I, but it was really interesting because he was very enthusiastic in the beginning and wanted to work on this. And then when he understood that I wanted it to be more about Michel and not just family history, he became very hesitant. And he was afraid that what he claimed that he was going to upset the family with certain, he said, well, you don't tell your mother Sylvie, but they think he was a communist. I'm like, I knew that. That since I was a little kid, my mother knows that that's not problematic. But the interesting thing is that, okay, he backed out because he didn't want to upset the family, but he still said, although I don't want to be part of your project, I will still answer your questions. And he answered them so beautifully, and in very interesting stories that he told me, which I ended up using in my film, and he's the anonymous cousin.
What I think also is that the formal use that you have of archive in this project is also specific because now in Syria, we don't have access to political archive. We don't have access to the archive of prisons since the fall of Assad. You were mentioning that a few archive was accessible, but also it was like a material that no one could access, even classified archive. So it's important that maybe as an artist, you construct a narrative of imaginary archive of that you classify yourself. Maybe and you didn't mention it, but if you read the letters, we see that your uncle stopped wanting to participate when you mentioned blowing your cousin when you mentioned the movie, and like it's you're giving references to him, and like he said, oh, if it's about blow up movie, I'm not sure I want to participate.
And it was strange. And he said, maybe I'm too much of an engineer to see this connection, but I don't feel that one could find the solution or what exactly happened. He was seeing my reference too literally. And I think he was trying to find every excuse to back out. But the beautiful part is that he answered the questions in such a compelling way that he gave me such great material. And he still has no idea that I'm using it.
So maybe now we can move forward to see an extract of A Portrait of Michel, the teaser. This is a movie about, you were saying it, first disappearance of your uncle and its abduction in 78. Before this, we see the trailer. Can we say with this project you started being an investigator? You told me once that you like this posture of being like an artist, but also investigating.
It's funny because I always say this, like when I was a kid, when you think about what do you want to be when you grow up, the three things I wanted to be were an artist, a musician, or a detective.
So and you were the three.
I mean, a musician, no, but I have a strong affinity to music, and I'm working. Of course, I've worked with sound, but what I'm creating is, of course, visual work and being a detective. I think also to just give a bit of background, why this project has taken me so long to finally do something, or this idea has taken me so long to finally do something with it, is because, like I said earlier, I never had a visual to work with. I had the stories. And I worked a lot with mapping, and I couldn't imagine doing something with maps and Michel's disappearance. It just didn't make sense until my cousins, and this was during COVID, they were living in Beirut, but they were back in their home in Damascus, and they called me up really because they know I've been working on these projects, and they called me up really excited, telling me that they just happened to find in their house in Damascus this little pouch that belonged to Michel with his objects and these random papers. And they said, maybe this could be of use for you. And I said, absolutely. So they started photographing them for me because this is during COVID and the mail system, of course, wasn't really working. And I was actually too afraid to put that in the mail. I did not want this to get lost. And, we were discussing over the phone. I was giving them art direction, how to photograph them, but it wasn't really working so well because I had an image in my mind and I was like, here, let me just do it myself. And luckily, a friend of theirs came to Berlin and brought the pouch with her. She came for work and I never met her, but she left it at the lobby of the hotel. And I went to the lobby of the hotel and I picked it up and it was incredible. I mean, this pouch from 1978, which in so many photographs of his, he's holding this pouch. And I took it back home and the zipper is crumbling. The leather smells like, it's been like in the basement for 40 years. And I took out every single piece of paper and object and scrap, everything, and photographed it as if I were a detective after the scene of a crime, front and back, front and back. And that was the start. That was the final impetus of like, aha, now I finally have something to work with where I can create a story about Michel. I still wasn't certain, is it going to be a film? Because I don't work with film. I'm more of just a visual artist. But I kept seeing this as a moving book. And so the only way for me to create this book, and I didn't feel like doing another book. I was like, so I imagined it being a film, or I was calling it a video. I wasn't comfortable calling it a film, in motion. And
also you mentioned it was because some archive video of your family
exactly
that in the trailer.
Exactly. I was just going to mention that. And what also really made it click is because I remember this old, amazing film, an 8mm film from my grandmother's uncle. He came by boat in 1946. He was living in Massachusetts, and he and his wife went by boat to Lebanon, and they met the family there in Lebanon and in Syria. And he had an 8mm camera, which nobody had seen then. Nobody had ever, nobody was super comfortable in general being in front of the camera, but you can see how they are in this video. They're dancing, and it was just something so beautiful. And when I discovered, and Michel was, at that time, he was only maybe 2 years old. So you don't see him in the footage, but he's there because his whole family's there, his siblings, his mother, his father. So as when you're ready to play it, then you guys can see that it was important for me because those were really golden years for my family in the 40s.
Okay, so maybe let's play the trailer.
When I went back to Syria in 2010 and I went to Palmyra, I had such an oppressive feeling because we heard that he was in jail in Palmyra. And I was very tempted to go to the jail and ask about him. But I was traveling with my husband, my American husband, and I didn't know what the consequences would be. So I didn't do it. But that was many, many, many years after he had disappeared. So I really don't know what would be the result of such a visit. And I didn't even know where the jail was. I didn't know how to get there or what to do. So I decided not to do it. But I regret it, thinking back now. I was in Palmyra. He was in jail in Palmyra. Maybe I could have done something, but I don't know what.
سيادة الرئيس حافظ الأسد رئيس الجمهورية المحترم، مقدمته مجيدة أرملة المرحوم عبد الله السعدي من أهالي وسكان حلب. اسمحوا لي أن أطرح أمام سيادتكم مشكلتي المؤلمة التي قد تعجبون لها وتستغربون حدوثها في قطرنا الحبيب، خاصة في عهدكم الميمون، عهد السلام والعطاء، عهد الأمن والرخاء، وكل ثقة لا بل إيمان من أنكم سوف تولون قضية.
now we saw a trailer of this movie. We will talk a bit later about the recent screening of the project. What I feel in your work, Christine, is that when you use archive, you use it always with a testimony of your family or always with a narrative. It's not just a use of archive, but it's archive with a story. And we saw in the trailer that the movie was constructed with like times of testimonies, written or oral testimonies, sometimes with photographs, sometimes with video. It's like you are composing with some, you know, how do you say when it's a detective doing proof? Like you are composing and mixing with some element, but it's not just about archive, but it's also archive and what people have to say about the archive and also to build a story. Can you tell us maybe about this composition that you and editing about this document to create this movie? The movie is actually about 45 minutes.
Yeah, well, I mean, I worked on this for quite a while, and the editing was probably the most difficult part, not finding the material. It was working with the timing and obviously deciding what to put in and what to leave out, and also deciding which stories should be left as oral stories and which ones should be just as text, because I noticed a difference. There were certain stories I felt like are much more compelling when the viewer actually reads it in silence versus hearing it. And other stories, it was more interesting, or was just much more impactful to hear the person's voice speaking. So there were a lot of decisions being made with that, as well as the order of, you know, what imagery do I use when this person is speaking. And I didn't want the image to relate too closely to what was being said, but to also give a feeling. So, you know, we don't have that much of besides that pouch. And then there's other things I included, like Michel's thesis, and there was some other random things, but we don't have much left of his, which is why it'd been so difficult for me to do something with it. But through just finding a way, and it was amazing that I got it up to 44 minutes. I thought it was just going to be 20 minutes. But there was just there was just such good information from everybody that as I started working on it, I realized this is actually becoming a narrative. It's of course, to me, I see it as an experimental art film, but there was such a narrative to it that I could not, there was nothing I could exclude at that point. And I thought it was also important for the viewer to engage in this detective, you know, mission of trying to figure out what possibly had happened to Michel. And I wanted to leave it at the end in a way where there's no answer, and there is no answer.
Maybe we will mention in a few minutes other displays of this project that you're thinking of, but we can just say that you have been screening this movie a few weeks ago a few months ago in Aleppo. You traveled there after 20 years of not being in Aleppo. Can you share maybe with us this experience? How did the public host the film? How was your feeling being back in Aleppo?
It was incredible. I want to go back. It really was magical being in Aleppo, being in Syria, but especially in Aleppo, just because that's where my family is from. And I mean, I don't even know where to start with just.
Can you maybe tell us where it was? What is this place?
In the old power station. For people in Aleppo, they would know it. And I actually had an uncle that used to work there in the 50s. He was an engineer, and you can see it's beautiful. It's a huge, massive structure. And now they're using it, well, they're using it for many things, but they're also using it for cultural events. So this woman she learned about this film, my project, when I did an interview with
Sabine?
Yeah, exactly. But what's the name?
Sabine Borossian.
Sabine
Borossian?
Yeah, that's Sabine, but what's the name of the organization?
I don't know. I don't
Okay, I'm totally blank right now. But I did, again, an interview about my work, and she had seen it. and she's from Aleppo, and she told me that she runs this space and she would love if I can show my film there. And this is obviously the first time a film like this was shown in Syria. Which is amazing is that I also have a friend, Dima, who lives in Berlin. She's originally from Aleppo, and she's back there now because she's working on, she's an architect, so she's working on restoring the Beit Wakil. And she knew a lot of old family friends of ours that she connected me with. And yeah, the Karasi Collective is who I showed it with. Thank you, Basil. That's who I showed it with in Aleppo. So Dima had introduced me to some of these old family friends who actually even knew Michel, and they were friends with him. And some were just visiting. They were just happened to be back in Syria. They live in Europe, and those people had left. And the first thing they said to me is, what a strange story that was. And you would think like friends normally would know a little bit more. You know, the family, of course, is going to be like, oh, he never would do anything. He was a perfect boy. And friends would have another side, you know, and they all were like, this was just perplexing. It was a very strange disappearance. It made no sense. But the beautiful thing is that they all came. They all came to the screening. There was maybe 4 or 5 of them. And it was a great turnout. There was probably about like 45 people. And it was interesting showing it in Syria as opposed to other countries because everywhere else is like, oh my God, how could this happen? No, no, no. And in Syria, everyone's like, oh yeah, I have my uncle that disappeared. I have my cousin that disappeared. I mean, everybody has a very similar story. And what's interesting is also it got written up in Sana, which is like the state-sponsored government propaganda media, which was, you know, all Assad propaganda for decades, and now it's the new government. But it got written up in that paper, which was quite incredible. And I'm hoping to show it again in Syria. I mean, there is interest from other people. I could show it maybe in Damascus or in Homs, but you know, we'll see slowly. I have to, you know, it was a bit of a. Before going to Syria, there was, it was like while I was planning my trip, Israel bombed Damascus. So, you know, I have to, of course, find a little pocket of peace before I run back.
No, we were saying that we are maybe in a hopeful moment in which this kind of projects can happen. And for example, a few days ago, Hala Abdallah has been screening a movie about Omar Alai in Damascus, and she was saying she would not think that one day in her life she would be able to screen a movie in Damascus. So it's super nice that we can live these kinds of screenings. Maybe to close the conversation, could you tell us what projects you're currently working on, and to continue this project and explore maybe the figure of Michel? You were speaking maybe of an installation.
Yeah, well, right now I don't know what format it's going to be. I think it might even just be another film, but probably a shorter one with also an installation, other works. But it's now doing a project called Searching for Michel, or In Search of Michel. I haven't really formalized the title completely yet. But I was just, when I was back in Syria, that was also because I got a grant in Germany to continue these projects on Syria. So I was back there and photographing, tracing Michel's steps in Damascus, where he was staying at his brother, at my Uncle David's house, and walking to the Seven Fountains Square, which I imagined was his last walk, because that's where he got abducted. I also got permission. We went with my cousin, we went to Sednaya prison and photographed and filmed there, which was incredible. We're not so certain if he were still alive at the time of Sednaya. There's some people who think he could have been there. Some think he might have been already killed at that point. But still, to be able to go there and film and photograph and have all of this footage. And it was amazing because it was a bit of a runaround. You know, I wouldn't be able to do this on my own. I was with my cousin, and we went to get permission. You had to go to the Ministry of Public Relations, and it was a whole runaround. I mean, I wasn't even certain I was going to be able to get to Sednaya. They were going to give us permission in time because I was only in Damascus for about 7-10 days. We finally got permission, but it got expedited because the man who was in charge, this is after the second visit there, to kind of beg them, please, can we go? He really made an effort because when he heard the story, and he was so touched by it, and he said it's important for stories like this to to be relayed, to be coming out. So he made his phone calls and basically called the Sednaya prison guards and said, they're going to come tomorrow, let them in. And it was incredible. And there was a young guard, he was maybe like 22 years old with a big rifle working, and he looked very intimidating, but super nice. And he took us around and he showed us all of the torture, torture equipment, the cells. I mean, it was a horror. And besides that, you're seeing it after it got looted too. So after all the prisoners escaped, and so many people went in and looted anything of value inside the prison. So everything was just kind of all over the place. So now I have all of this footage and material and doing more research. And I also had spoken to friends of Michel's in Syria who, nobody has any information, but I'm just collecting interviews, let's say. And I'm going to see what's going to come next, basically.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. This was a nice conversation also about how family archive can be also about politics. I think now we can open the questions to the people that are here. I don't know if someone would like to ask something.
I do have a question.
Please, Nadia.
It's about, because I also kind of touch about the topic of archive and artists. And for many years, and from, different countries in war, usually the artists consider themselves as if they have the duty to archive, because sometimes the news doesn't cover everything, as you said, Christine, at the beginning. Do you feel like the duty of archiving affects the creative process, or do you consider it as something that is more of a source of inspiration from your personal experience and from considering other Syrian artists' work too?
Yeah, no, I mean, I could just speak for myself. I don't know about other Syrian artists, but I think it's more for me, it was more of an inspiration. Maybe I wouldn't call it a duty, because that sounds so like something unenjoyable, but I felt there was a lot of fulfillment, for example, when I showed Aleppo Deconstruction, Reconstruction, the map project, the first time in New York at Jane Lombard Gallery. And people, I couldn't believe at the opening, everybody was reading the stories, like 15 different stories. And usually at opening, everybody's just socializing. And so many people came up to me afterwards telling me how touched they were by the stories. But besides that, saying, I had no idea Syria was like that, like the good parts of Syria, because the stories go from especially my mother's stories were much more poetic, and my uncle Nabil's stories start talking more about the politics and the tragedies. And I think it was important for me to relay that, because it's like people just think Syrians as just being war victims and refugees and suffering and struggling, and not also knowing who they are as a culture, who they are as people. When I was just back there in Aleppo, I mean, Syria in general, but just especially in Aleppo, I mean, the people are just so warm, so generous, so welcoming. You buying kak, like little cookies on the street from this guy who probably makes no money. He gave me like 100 samples of cookies. Like he didn't even care if I bought any. I mean, and that you don't see in these Western capitalist countries. And it's very much of a Syrian mentality. It's this warmth and generosity and this pride of who they are and wanting to share that. So I think maybe in some ways I do feel like it's important to share these stories, the good and the bad, and Michel's story as well, because people have just been focusing on the last 12, 13 years since the war had started in under Bashar. But most people don't know about how brutal his father was as well. So I think through my storytelling, it's a way of also touching on the universal, because so many people from different countries can relate to them, but also telling the story about Syria as well.
I think by duty, I kind of meant the fact that you sometimes feel maybe some kind of an obligation to be the most accurate with the collection of your informations, so that in case it actually leads to results in investigation or something, perhaps it kind of puts some pressure on the creative process. It's not a negative thing at all, but especially us who work a lot with maps and mapping, and the family archive, that isn't considered as something like, for example, it's not something that we find in libraries or the national I don't know, archives or whatever. But yeah, so it's something that comes from personal experience, and maybe we sometimes doubt that the accuracy could be like the part of the duty of an artist or an archivist.
Yeah. But then, you know, I'm working so much with memory as well, and how accurate is memory too. You know, there are stories that we're told where it's like later I was like, my mother's like, no, wait, did I say that? But maybe I meant this. Maybe this is what happened. So I think there's also just how we remember things, and how we as people, how we create our histories through our own stories, and how accurate are they? I mean, they are as well as you know, as good as our memory is. So yeah, I don't. Of course, I want things to be as perfect as possible, but like, for example, the Sednaya prison, mentioning that Michel might have been in Sednaya, then I realized later he might not have been, if family was saying by 1981, 82, we didn't hear any information from him anymore. And Sednaya, I think, was built in 86. So there are things like that where I realized, okay, some of the information that I was using in my work maybe wasn't that accurate. I think one needs some flexibility as working as an artist and working with memory, because I'm not a bona fide researcher and writing books on the history of Syria. I'm doing it in a more poetic way, I think.
Thank you.
I think we have a question from Nikki.
Hi. Hi, Christine. Nice to see you. I think you are a bona fide archivist. So I'm over here with a bunch of drawing students, and we're watching you. I have you projected in the studio.
Oh.
And I would just like you to say a few words to them, like about how, in a sense, in a very general sense, all drawing and all art is an archive. Something about that. Thank you.
Okay, well, I don't see the students. I need to see faces. Yeah, okay, hello. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think things need to be labeled as such. I really feel like how one is working with something, if you're touching on your own history, whether it's your personal history or the history of the place you come from, or any story you want to tell, whether it's yours or somebody else's, what could make it an archive is in a way that if it has some tangible sense to it, that it relays some information that other people can gain as well. And I think to me, that's the form of storytelling. So whether it's with words or whether it's just with drawings and maps or what other, kind of visual examples that one would use, I think all of that can translate into some storytelling. I hope I answered your question.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry.
Please.
I mean, art is ultimately a reflection of your times, right? So no matter what you do, whether you work with storytelling, whether you work with public archives or personal archives or family archives, art is a reflection of the times, and it's inadvertently going to be an archive, an ongoing archive that is endless, with a start with no end. I think this is really important to also to be noteful of.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and there is a difference also between documents and archive and artworks, and that could be a conversation for a next MASA session to see also what is an archive and what can be an archive. And I think we will, in the second season, talk about these kinds of things with our colleague Noor. So a little teaser of this. Anna, please, we're listening to your question.
Hello. I would like to ask a question. I was able to screen Portrait of Michel here in Brazil, and there was something that I would like to ask you about the editing, because there is something very interesting in this film. That is the silence and the black screens, because I believe that these are also archive, especially when you're dealing with absence, and like the sound, and it goes without, it's like without any specific transition, and the black screen and moments without moments, many moments of silence. And I wonder if that was taught during the editing, since you talked about this struggle of the editing process, how you dealt with the I'd like to hear more about how you dealt with this absence in your process.
Yeah, I mean, at first when I was working on it, I was working with the sound designer, and we did start, it was first silent, and I actually really liked it silent. But once it started to become longer, I realized it needs a little bit more, and I needed to break up the silence. So I worked with a sound designer, and at first he was creating these sounds that I would put in the background of the text, and even just ambient sound. And every sound he put felt so distracting for me. And it was just about reducing, like, no, take it out, take it out, take it out. And then I realized, I said, this is about absence. And it was important to convey that. And by having the sound, which would just be a distraction, would just be an unnecessary layer, is how I saw it. It just, the story, having the viewer read these stories on screen of Michel, who he was, I think would have had less of an impact if it got diluted by the sound. So it was really important for me to keep that silence, and then to have the moments over the 8mm, because those are the joyous times, and also just to have the voices coming in as well. And that was how with the editing, it was trying to create that kind of rhythm, that fluidity, that in and out kind of thread that was coming through those 44 minutes. Thank you.
It's so nice to hear that the movie has been screened in Brazil.
Yes, thank you. It's thanks to Analu, and it had 2 screenings there at the Arab Women's Film Festival.
Yes, the Arab Women's Film Festival in Brazil. We screened it in Recife City, it's in the Northeast, and in Rio de Janeiro. It was they were great screenings. And you mentioned the reception in Rio de Janeiro. We had a discussion with a Syrian immigrant who lives in Rio, and it was like a different perspective. It wasn't just like I didn't think that happened in Syria. He brought his personal story connected with Portrait of Michel. It was very cool to do this.
Oh, that's great. I wish I was curious to see how it went, because obviously I wasn't there. So that's nice that there was a nice conversation about it afterwards. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yes, I was thinking also it would be a nice movie to project in Argentina, because in Argentina also during the dictatorship there is an history of a lot of disappearance, forced disappearance, and I was thinking it would be nice to also see how it reflects with the Argentinian experience. After this, I will send you, Christine, some references of also other artists who have done kind of this work to investigate about the disappearance of members of family or friends in the context of the dictatorship in Argentina.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah, I mean, that's what I was saying before, just keeping it also on the universal, because there's so many, it's not just about Syria. I mean, it's just in the United States. I showed it in New York in March and April. And then the abduction of, what's his name, the Columbia University student. I think it happened right around then, right? Mahmoud Khalil, is that his name? You know, of course, it's not on the same level, but still, to feel like something like this can happen in the United States, where people always felt like, oh, the land of democracy and freedom. So this is why I feel like it's also important to tell this story in a way that people from other countries can still relate to.
I was just wondering to know what are the next screenings. If there's next
Yeah, in Berlin, I'm having a screening and an exhibition on December 3rd at Labor 19. I don't know if there's people here that live in Berlin, and also a talk with Nihat Cerise, who I became friends with, which is really nice. So we're going to have a conversation about our work in Syria, and we'll see where that goes. And also in New York at Film Co-op on December 12th. I have a screening there. So if anybody here is from New York, you can see it there. And then we'll see what comes next year. So I'm sure there'll be more coming next year.
I was saying it would be nice to project it in France. So we will talk about it later.
Exactly. That would be great. Yes, hopefully soon.
Tshireen, please.
I had a question. I mean, throughout the entire presentation and all of the excerpts that we saw, there was an intersection of archives, but also there's a storytelling. There's the personal that became public. But how can you, and how can you be impartial, or do you need to be impartial? Because it's really difficult. There's always this tension between the personal becoming public, and between the story being told about family, but it's a story of a whole country. So there's always this tension between this duality. Do you need to be impartial, or?
Well, in a way, it's funny because people also commented in the Portrait of Michel in the film. I'm an outsider. I'm quoting relatives, and I'm even quoting myself as if it's not me. You know, there's the text stories on the screen, and it would be like blah, blah, blah about Michel, and then Michel's sister Sylvie, and then there'd be a story that I would tell, and it would be Michel's niece, Christine. It's not easy, of course, to be impartial. I don't think I could be. I'm choosing which stories to tell. But that's just how one creates a narrative to keep people also interested and intrigued in what are the most important parts of this mystery that needs to be relayed. But in being impartial, I also try to make sure to not have it sentimental. And I think that's when it becomes problematic. If there's just too much emotion connected to it. Yeah.
Yes, and maybe it's a position of the detective, but when we see the movie, we see like that you are presenting proofs, facts, part of the investigation, testimony. I mean, there is a narration from your part, but it's like there is a distance with the investigation. I feel that that is not too much personal. Enfin, it's personal, of course, but
exactly, and that was important for me to do. And I also think it's because I didn't grow up with Michel. I'd met him, not to say I don't have an emotional tie to him, but maybe it would be much more difficult if he were my brother. If I grew up with him and he disappeared, it'd probably be much more difficult. But because I was able to step back, because this is a story that I just knew all my life, but didn't really know him well, I was able to kind of have that clinical detective, outsider kind of way of relaying the story.
Okay, so do we have maybe another question in the public?
I would like to ask a question
Please.
About future projects.
Yeah, we were discussing that a little bit earlier. So when I went back to Syria, I'm now working in my head. I haven't worked it on anything yet, but the In Search of Michel, where I'm actually went back to Syria and following his steps and meeting people. I visited Sednaya prison and to see what else I can find. So the investigation continues. In which form? Probably another film, but I don't think it's going to be a long, maybe like a 20-minute film, but also with images, works on paper. It's kind of brewing in my mind, but it's not there. But I'm definitely continuing the story. I'm not ready to end it yet.
And if I can, just a follow-up, how is your art now or your projects impacted by the fact that you can pursue them in Syria and show them in Syria?
Well, it definitely makes it a lot easier in terms of at least going to Syria to get to collect information and evidence and meet people. Before I was doing everything from here, which that challenge also creates something interesting. And now, of course, there's less fear of the regime coming after us. Because even though I spoke in the beginning that my cousins and my uncle said it's okay, there's still a little bit of that, oh, I hope nobody gets in trouble for this. So that definitely has a much, I feel much more comfortable working on this now.
And actually, it opens a continuity to the film because when you did the film, the regime was not folded yet.
Yeah.
And now the fact that you could travel, that you're thinking a second part for the project, maybe it won't have been possible if the regime was still present because you won't travel to Syria.
Yeah,
also.
Exactly. I probably wouldn't continue up this project. Yeah. I probably would have done more stuff about Syria, but definitely not on Michel's story because I wouldn't be able, without going there and getting material, I don't think there was much else I could do from here.
And are you thinking you will find some material maybe in the archive, in the official archive, in present archive? You were mentioning last time that you had maybe an idea to find some elements, but Michel was not mentioned in the list of.
I have a friend here who's Palestinian Syrian, and he obtained, I don't know how many hundreds of files that his friend went and I think it was in the palace, in the presidential palace, after the fall of Assad. People went in and raided the palace and got all of these, looted stuff. He knows somebody that got all of these files of prisoners from the last 50 years. And he said he looked through them one by one. And he didn't find anything on Michel. But that's just, maybe 5% of the prisoners or 1%. I have no idea. So that's the whole, that's the whole mission now, In Search of Michel. I'm hoping that there will be files that are released. But even if I do find his file, is the information even going to be correct? They make up any excuse. I mean, they have to make up something to keep him in prison. So whatever they're going to say, we're still not going to know if that's the truth.
I mean, I've been aware of Christine's work for a few years now. I have the book on Aleppo. We've spoken a few times, but hearing you, Christine, talk more about it, like the entire body of work that you've done on this is just something different. I really enjoyed it, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for accepting the invite, and it's really, really refreshing.
Thank you. And it's great to be able to talk about this. And again, going back to the fall of Assad, like all of these stories are finally being told and released, and it's really important. And I'm really happy to be part of this. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you.
And,
thank you, Mathilde. Thank you.
It was a nice conversation. We hope to be able to see the movie soon in our different cities because we're all from different cities here. And have a good evening or day if you're in the USA.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that showed up and asked questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.